The first sound was a crack of thunder that did not belong to the sky. It was a dry, splintering roar that ripped through the afternoon haze of redemption, a sound of wood and iron giving way. It was the sound of a door being kicked in. 5 years. For 5 years, the loudest sound in Alara's life had been the rhythmic clang of Jedediah's hammer on steel, a music of creation that had slowly, painstakingly hammered the jagged edges of her soul into something smooth enough to live with. She had come to this town with nothing but the clothes on her back and a silence so profound it was a presence of its own. Redemption had been a lie of a name, but it had offered a respite. Here, under a sun that bleached all color from the world, she was just a girl who kept to herself, the blacksmith's quiet apprentice. Now that peace shattered. The hammer in her hand, poised to strike a glowing horseshoe, clattered to the dirt floor of the smithy. Jedediah looked up from the bellows, his face a road map of wrinkles and soot creased with alarm. What in blazes? People were shouting on Main Street. A woman screamed a sharp, piercing cry that was cut short. Then came the gunshots, not the measured boom of a duel, but a chaotic volley. Panic. Jedediah moved toward the wide open doors of the forge, his old hands reaching for a shotgun he kept propped against a water barrel. "Stay back, Alara." But she was already moving her body, acting on an instinct she had long tried to bury. She didn't move toward the door, but to the side, into the deep shadows, where the forge's heat couldn't reach. Her eyes, the color of a storm-darkened sky, scanned the street through the gap between the doorframe and the wall. Men on horseback, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, were holding the street. One was forcing a terrified clerk from the bank to his knees. Another was firing his pistol into the air, his laughter a raw, ugly sound that scraped at the quiet. A gang, robbing the bank. It was a common enough plague in these parts, but something in the disciplined way they moved, the cold efficiency of their violence, felt different. It felt organized. Then she saw him. The leader. He sat easily on a powerful black stallion in the center of the chaos, a figure of calm authority. He wore a long, dark coat despite the heat, and his face was uncovered. He was handsome in a severe way, with a sharp jaw and eyes that seemed to absorb the light around them. He watched the scene unfold, not with the wild energy of a bandit, but with the detached air of a man reviewing his ledger. When the clerk hesitated to hand over a final sack of money, the leader didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply raised his gloved hand, and with a flick of his wrist, a short, impatient, utterly dismissive gesture, he gave the command. One of his men slammed the butt of his rifle into the clerk's head. The man crumpled. The gesture, that flick of the wrist, the world dissolved. The heat of the forge, the smell of coal and sweat, the panicked shouts from the street, it all vanished, sucked into a roaring vacuum. The red dust of redemption was gone, replaced by the choking gray ash of a dying fire. The sun was a blood-orange smear through thick, greasy smoke. She was 13 again, her nightgown torn and stained the air thick with the screams of her mother, the final defiant roar of her father. And then silence. A silence worse than the screaming. She was on her knees in the dirt of her own yard, surrounded by men whose faces were painted in nightmare streaks of mud and hate. They smelled of whiskey and old blood. One of them stood over the still forms of her parents. He was wiping a long knife on his pants. He turned, and his eyes, small and cruel, found her. He grinned, showing broken, yellowed teeth. Another man, the leader of the slavers, stepped forward. He was holding a length of chain attached to a crude iron collar. He barked an order at the man with the knife, his voice a gravelly rasp. He didn't point. He didn't speak a full command. He just flicked his wrist. The exact same gesture. A motion of absolute ownership, as if she were no more than a stray dog to be kicked. The man with the yellow teeth grabbed her hair, yanking her head back. The world tilted, a spinning vortex of smoke and terror. The cold, heavy iron of the collar was clamped around her neck. The lock clicked shut, a sound of finality, of a door closing on her life, on her name, on everything she had ever been. Another man approached, his face a blur. He carried a branding iron, its tip glowing a malevolent orange in the twilight. The heat of it washed over her face, and she could smell her own skin beginning to cook even before it touched her. She screamed a sound that had no beginning and no end. Ilara. Jedediah's voice was an anchor, pulling her back from the drowning depths of memory. She was gasping, her back pressed hard against the rough wood of the smithy wall. Her hand was at her throat, fingers tracing the faint scarred line beneath her jaw, a ghost of the iron that had once been there. The robbers were leaving, galloping out of town with their stolen money, leaving behind a wounded clerk and a cloud of dust that hung in the air like a shroud. The man on the black stallion, the leader, was the last to go. Before he spurred his horse, his gaze swept across the street. For a heart-stopping second, his eyes seemed to lock with hers through the shadows. There was no recognition, only a cold, predatory assessment of the town he had just violated. Then he turned and was gone. Ilara. Are you all right, child? Jedediah was beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man who spent his days wrestling with iron. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, a jerky, unconvincing movement. The flashback had left her shaking, her body slick with a sweat that had nothing to do with the forge's heat. The past was not dead. She had known that. She had simply built a wall around it, a forge-fired barrier of routine and silence. But the man with the cruel flick of his wrist had just walked through that wall as if it were smoke. His name was Silas Blackwood. She'd heard it whispered in the saloons, a name synonymous with ruthless ambition, a man who was buying up land and crushing anyone who stood in his way. Until now, he had been a phantom, a local terror she had managed to avoid. Now he was the ghost from her past, wearing a different face, or was he? The gesture was too specific, too identical. It was a brand on her memory, as permanent as the one on her skin. It couldn't be a coincidence. Her quiet life was over. The past hadn't just found her. It had galloped down Main Street and fired a warning shot into the heart of her sanctuary. Redemption was a town gasping for breath. It squatted in a valley where the red sand glowed like embers under the unforgiving sun, and the wind whispered through the skeletons of long-dead cattle that dotted the hillsides. It was a place people passed through on their way to somewhere better, but for Ilara, it was the end of the line. Jedediah's smithy stood at the edge of Main Street, a solid soot-stained bastion against the encroaching emptiness. Its rhythmic heartbeat of hammer on anvil was the town's pulse. Inside, Ilara found a purpose. The forge demanded all of her attention, its searing heat a physical distraction from the cold fire that smoldered within her. Under Jedediah's patient tutelage, she learned to read the language of the metal, to know by the color of the glow when it was ready to yield, to feel through the hammer the precise moment it would take a new shape. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and strong. She was precise, her movements economical. She rarely wasted emotion or word. This careful, controlled world was the only one she could bear to live in. Jedediah, a man whose own wife and son had been taken by cholera a decade prior, had seen the raw pain in the young woman who had stumbled into his forge 5 years ago, half-starved and mute with trauma. He hadn't asked for her story. He had simply offered her a ladle of water, a piece of bread, and a place to sleep on a cot in the back. In the quiet language of shared work and mutual respect, he had become the father she had lost. He taught her a trade, and she, in her silent, fierce loyalty, gave him a reason to keep the forge fires burning. Her only other connection was to a man who lived outside the world of redemption entirely. Maka, the Dakota warrior who had freed her, had not abandoned her. He lived a solitary life in the rocky hills that overlooked the town. He had broken his tribe's sacred law by freeing a slave who was not his to free, and he could not go back. He he was an outcast, same as her. Their bond was forged in a shared, unspoken understanding. He never came into town, but some mornings Ilara would find a freshly dressed rabbit or a brace of quail left silently on the smithy's back stoop. On evenings when the weight of her memories pressed too close, she would walk to the edge of town and see the faint flicker of his campfire high in the hills, a distant, steady light that told her she was not completely alone. He was her guardian, her ghost, a reminder of the one act of impossible kindness in a world that had shown her none. He watched over her, their silent pact needing no words to be understood. This fragile peace was now threatened by Silas Blackwood. His ambition was a slow-moving poison seeping into the town. He was buying up the homesteads, the ranches, the businesses, one by one. His methods were legal on the surface, offering prices that seemed generous until the sellers realized they had nowhere else to go. Those who refused found their wells mysteriously fouled, their livestock scattered, their fences cut. The sheriff, a man whose spine seemed to be made of jelly, was either paid off or too cowardly to intervene. Jedediah's smithy was the last business on Main Street that Blackwood didn't own. It was more than just a piece of property. It was the heart of the community, the place where tools were mended, plows were forged, and the town's life was literally shaped. For Blackwood, it was an intolerable symbol of defiance. For Jedediah, it was his legacy. For Ilara, it was the only home she had left. The day after the robbery, the air in Redemption was thick with fear. The bank remained closed, its door a splintered ruin. People spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously down the street. The raid hadn't just been about money. It had been a demonstration of power, a clear message from Blackwood that the law in this town was whatever he said it was. Ilara was sharpening a set of plowshares, her movements tight and controlled, when the shadows of two men fell across her workbench. She looked up, her hand instinctively tightening on the handle of a heavy rasp. It was Silas Blackwood. He was flanked by one of the men from the robbery, a hulking brute with a mean, flattened nose. Blackwood was dressed impeccably in a tailored black coat and polished boots, a stark contrast to the dust and grime of the forge. He smiled, a thin, predatory curve of his lips that didn't touch his cold eyes. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that felt utterly out of place. He ignored Ilara and addressed Jedediah, who was standing by the anvil, his face grim. "I trust you are well, Jedediah." "Well enough," Jedediah grunted, not bothering to hide his contempt. He wiped his hands on a greasy rag. "What do you want, Blackwood?" Blackwood strolled further into the smithy, his gaze sweeping over the tools, the glowing coals, the barrels of iron. He ran a gloved finger along a finished wagon wheel, then looked at the tip as if checking for dirt. "I'm a man who appreciates fine craftsmanship. And history. This place has both. But history, like old iron, must eventually be reshaped for a new purpose." He stopped in front of the old blacksmith. "I am here to renew my generous offer for this property. In fact, I am prepared to increase it by 20%. A final gesture of goodwill. Jedediah's jaw tightened. "My answer is the same as it was last month and the month before that. This place isn't for sale." Blackwood's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Jedediah, the inevitable can only be delayed, not denied. Your signature is all that stands between this dusty relic and progress." He gestured vaguely toward the street. "I am building a new future for this valley, a future of prosperity. This anachronism is in the way. This relic has more honor in its foundation than you have in your whole body." Silas Jedediah said, his voice low and steady. "It was built by my father, and it'll pass to my kin. It's not for sale." Blackwood was about to respond when a third voice cut through the tension, as clear and sharp as striking steel. He said, "It's not for sale." Both men turned. Ilara had stepped out from behind the workbench. She hadn't raised her voice, but it carried an unnerving weight, a finality that made even the brute beside Blackwood shift his feet. She stood with her shoulders back, the heavy leather apron, unable to hide the defiant strength in her posture. Her eyes were fixed on Blackwood, unwavering. Blackwood's gaze lingered on her, a flicker of cruel amusement mixed with surprise. He hadn't expected the quiet apprentice to speak. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering for a moment on the faint scar at her throat. A brief, almost imperceptible frown creased his brow, as if he were trying to place a half-forgotten memory. He dismissed it and turned back to Jedediah, his smile returning colder than before. "You have a loyal apprentice. A commendable trait." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But loyalty can be a liability. I will give you 48 hours to reconsider my offer. After that, well, forges are dangerous places. All that fire and coal dust. It would be a tragedy if there were to be an unfortunate accident." He held Jedediah's gaze for a long moment, the threat hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. Then he turned, gave Alara one last dismissive look, and strode out of the smithy, his man trailing behind him like a loyal dog. The silence they left behind was heavy. Jedediah let out a long, weary breath and sank onto a nearby stool. He looked old suddenly. The fire seemed to have gone out of him. Alara watched the street until Blackwood and his man were out of sight. The wall she had built around her past was crumbling, and the monster she had run from was standing on the other side, wearing a new face, but making the same threats. He had threatened her home. He had threatened her family. She had spent 5 years hiding from the fight. Now the fight had come to her. The choice to remain silent, to remain a victim, was no longer hers to make. The ultimatum expired on a moonless night. Alara hadn't slept. She'd spent the last 2 days working with a frantic energy, her hammer blows echoing the frantic beating of her own heart. Jedediah had tried to pretend it was business as usual. But the tension was a physical thing in the forge, a high-pitched hum beneath the roar of the fire. The warning came not as a direct assault, but as a plume of angry orange smoke rising from the west. The Miller place. Old Man Miller had been one of the few homesteaders who had publicly refused Blackwood's offers. "Sweet heavens," Jedediah whispered, standing beside Alara in the street. The whole town was watching silent and helpless as fire consumed the Miller's barn. It was a spectacle of terror, a message written in flames for all of Redemption to see. The sheriff and a few volunteers rode out, but everyone knew it was a hollow gesture. They would find nothing but embers and frightened livestock. Jedediah turned to her, his face illuminated by the distant flickering light. "He'll come for us next." "No," Alara said, her voice a low growl. "I'll go to him." Before Jedediah could protest, she slipped back into the shadows of the forge. She didn't mean a direct confrontation. Not yet. She was a blacksmith, not a gunslinger. But she was also a survivor. The 3 brutal months she had spent as a captive, traded between tribes, had taught her things a judge's daughter should never have known. She had learned to move silently, to read the signs left on the earth, to see in the dark. She had learned to track. She waited until the town had settled into a fearful slumber, and then saddled the old mare Jedediah kept for errands. Dressed in dark, practical clothing, with a hunting knife strapped to her belt and a small satchel of tools, she rode not towards the Miller farm, but in a wide circle around it, approaching from downwind. The barn was a smoldering skeleton against the star-dusted sky. The air stank of burnt wood and hay. She tethered the mare in a copse of mesquite trees and approached on foot, her steps making no sound on the packed earth. The sheriff's posse had come and gone, their own tracks clumsy and obvious. Alara moved like a phantom, her eyes scanning the ground. The men who did this were professionals. They wouldn't have been careless. But fire, for all its destructive power, could also preserve. The intense heat had baked the ground around the barn, hardening it like clay. There, near the collapsed rear wall, sheltered from the main blaze, was a set of tracks. Several men, but one print was deeper, clearer than the others. It was a large boot, the heel worn down on the left side. But it was the sole that caught her attention. It had a unique pattern, a diamond crosshatch she didn't recognize from any of the local cobblers. She followed the tracks away from the barn toward a dry creek bed, where they must have left their horses. And there, glinting in the faint starlight, was a small piece of metal. She knelt, teasing it from the dirt with the tip of her knife. It was a horseshoe nail. Not a standard mass-produced nail from a town smithy. This one was custom. It was thicker, with a broad, fluted head, designed for a heavier-than-average shoe, the kind used on large draft horses or the powerful war ponies favored by mercenaries. She held it in her palm, and the metal cool against her skin. She knew this design. During her captivity, she had been forced to work mending tools, tending fires. One of the tribes that had held her had been a brutal band of raiders who did business with slavers and outlaws. Their farrier used nails just like this one, forged at a specific remote outpost forge far to the south, a place notorious for outfitting the worst kind of men. A cold certainty washed over her. The men who burned this barn were not just Blackwood's hired thugs. They were connected to the same dark network, the same world that had swallowed her whole 5 years ago. This nail was more than a clue. It was a link. A piece of iron that connected Silas Blackwood's land-grabbing scheme directly to the slavers who had destroyed her family. She pocketed the nail, her mind racing. The connection was no longer a suspicion born of a fleeting gesture. It was a tangible, physical fact. Blackwood wasn't just some greedy land baron. He was tied to them. Her quiet investigation into a local tyrant had just become a hunt for the ghosts of her past. The next morning, Alara walked into the sheriff's office. Deputy Miller, a young man, barely out of his teens with a perpetually worried expression, looked up from his paperwork. Sheriff Brody was as usual nowhere to be seen. Miss Alara, the deputy said, surprised. She rarely spoke to anyone, let alone the law. She placed the custom horseshoe nail on his desk without a word. "I found this at the Miller place last night." Miller picked it up, his brow furrowed in confusion. "It's a nail. It's a nail from the forge at Crimson Creek," she stated, her voice flat. "They only make them for one kind of customer. Slavers, bandits, the men who supply them." The deputy's eyes widened. He knew the reputation of Crimson Creek. How do you know that?" "I know," she said, the words carrying a weight that forbade further questions. "The men Blackwood is using are not just hired muscle. They're part of something bigger, something older." Miller looked from the nail to Alara's intense, unblinking gaze. He was a decent man in an impossible position, caught between his duty and his fear of Blackwood. He knew something was deeply wrong in their valley, but he lacked the power and the courage to confront it. Seeing the conviction in Alara's eyes, a spark of resolve flickered within him. "Blackwood's too smart to leave a trail," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But his supply wagons, they come in twice a month. From the south, they use the old canyon road to avoid town." It was all she needed. That night she wasn't in the hills overlooking Redemption, but in the rocky terrain bordering the old canyon road. A small fire, shielded by a rock overhang, burned nearby. Maka was with her. She had sought him out, a silent meeting at dusk, where she had simply shown him the nail. He had looked at it, then at her, and a deep, grim understanding had passed between them. He knew the mark of those men better than anyone. They sat in silence, watching the road below. Maka was a man of immense patience, as still and weathered as the ancient stones around them. He had taught her this stillness, this ability to merge with the landscape. Just after midnight, they heard the rumble of wagon wheels. 2 heavy freights, escorted by 4 armed outriders, moved slowly up the canyon. As they passed beneath the overlook, Alara saw him. Riding at the rear was the man with the flattened nose, the same brute who had flanked Blackwood in the smithy. She and Maka shadowed the convoy for miles, moving through the high rocks like ghosts. They followed it to its destination, a heavily guarded, isolated depot hidden in a box canyon. It was more than a supply station. It was a small fortress. For 2 days, they watched, taking turns sleeping. They observed the comings and goings, the changing of the guards, and the routine. On the third night, under the cover of a brewing storm, they made their move. While Maka created a diversion, a rock slide on the far side of the canyon that drew most of the guards away. Alara slipped into the compound. She moved through the shadows, a wraith in the swirling dust. Her target was a small stone building that served as the depot's office. The lock on the door was crude. She picked it with a set of tools she had forged herself. Inside the room was Spartan, a desk, a chair, and a large iron safe. The safe was beyond her skills, but she wasn't looking for money. On the desk, left out in haste when the rock slide alarm was raised, was a large leather-bound ledger. Her heart pounded as she flipped it open. It detailed years of transactions, guns, ammunition supplies. But as she scanned the pages, she saw other entries. Payments. Large sums paid out to names she didn't recognize, but next to them were notes, acquisition, transport, delivery. Then she found it. An entry dated 5 years ago. The payment was massive, far larger than the others. It was made out to a slaving captain named Corbin, and beside it, a chillingly specific note. Final payment for the judge's affair. Special acquisition secured as requested. Girl with silver locket. The world tilted. The silver locket. It had been her mother's, passed down to her on her 13th birthday, just a week before the raid. She had been wearing it that night. It was torn from her neck as they dragged her away. This wasn't random. The raid on her family's homestead, the murder of her parents, her own capture, it had all been a transaction. A special acquisition. Ordered and paid for. And this ledger, this book of cold hard numbers, belonged to Silas Blackwood's supply network. A cold rage purer and harder than any steel she had ever forged settled in her heart. This was no longer just a suspicion, it was a certainty. Blackwood was connected to her past, not by coincidence, but by design. But why? Why her family? The ledger didn't say. It gave her the what, but not the why. To find that she would have to dig deeper into the heart of Blackwood's rotten empire. She carefully tore the page from the ledger, folded it, and tucked it safely away. The storm was breaking outside, the wind, howling through the canyon, mirroring the tempest that had just been unleashed within her. The name from the ledger, Corbin, was a dead end. He was a ghost, a slaving captain, who had likely met a grim end years ago. But the ledger contained other names, smaller players in Blackwood's network. One name, Tanner, appeared frequently associated with payments for information and scouting. Deputy Miller, his fear now eclipsed by a quiet determination, recognized it. Abel Tanner, he'd set his voice low. Used to be one of Blackwood's top men. Had a falling out a year or so back. Rumor is he saw something he shouldn't have. Blackwood broke him, took everything he had. Last I heard, he was holed up in the Skeleton Canyons, half mad and drinking himself to death. The Skeleton Canyons were a maze of treacherous, sun-bleached rock formations, a place where a man could disappear forever. It took Alara 2 days of hard riding to find Tanner's hideout, a miserable lean-to built against a sheer cliff face. She found him sitting outside, staring at the empty landscape with hollow eyes, a cheap whiskey bottle dangling from his hand. He was a shell of a man, his face a ruin of regret and alcohol. When he saw her, he flinched, his hand instinctively going for a pistol tucked in his belt. "Get away from me," he rasped, his voice raw. Alara dismounted slowly, keeping her hands in plain sight. She didn't speak. Instead, she took out the ledger page and held it up. Tanner's eyes widened. He stared at the page, at the familiar handwriting, at his own name, listed among the transactions. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a shuddering dread. Where did you get that?" From Blackwood's depot, Alara said, her voice even. I want to know about the entry for Judge Callan's family. The special acquisition. Tanner flinched as if struck. He looked at her face, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw the shape of her jaw, the color of her eyes, and a dawning horrified recognition spread across his features. The locket, he whispered. You're the girl. He scrambled backward away from her, as if she were an avenging spirit risen from the grave. I told him it was wrong, I told him. Told who Alara pressed, taking a step closer. Tell me everything, Tanner. Tell me why. The dam of Tanner's guilt and fear finally broke. The story poured out of him in a torrent of slurred, agonized words. It wasn't about land. It wasn't about greed. It was about revenge. It was never about your father's rulings, not really, he choked out. It was about his brother. Blackwood's younger brother, Michael. Michael Blackwood, he explained, had been a wild, violent youth. He had killed a prospector in a drunken brawl over a card game. The evidence was flimsy based on the word of a single, unreliable witness. But Judge Callan, Alara's father, was running for a territorial Senate seat at the time. He needed a high-profile conviction to cement his reputation as a man of law and order. Silas begged the judge, Tanner said, tears streaming down his face. He swore his brother was innocent, that the witness was lying. He offered him money, anything. But your father, he wouldn't listen. He pushed for the conviction. Michael hanged. The hanging broke something in Silas Blackwood. It twisted his grief into a cold, patient, all-consuming hatred. He didn't want simple revenge. He wanted to annihilate Judge Callan's legacy. He wanted to salt the earth of his entire existence. He planned it for years, Tanner whispered, his voice trembling. He used his inheritance to build his network to gather men like Corbin. He didn't just want to kill your father. He wanted to take everything from him first. His name, his land, his future. He wanted him to watch his world burn before he died. And the final, most cruel part of the plan was Alara herself. He wanted you to live. Tanner said, his voice barely audible. He wanted you sold into slavery, broken, your name forgotten. He wanted the last piece of the Callan bloodline to endure a life of suffering, a living monument to his revenge. Your capture. It was the whole point. Alara stood frozen, the desert wind cold against her skin. The truth was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Her entire life's tragedy, the cornerstone of her pain and grief, was not some random act of frontier violence. It was a meticulously crafted masterpiece of hatred. Silas Blackwood wasn't just a villain who had crossed her path. He was the architect of her very being, the man who had authored every moment of her suffering. The fight for a small smithy in a dusty town was over. This was a war for her own soul, a reckoning that had been 5 years in the making. The broken man in front of her was just the first casualty. The last would be Silas Blackwood. The moment Alara rode back into redemption, she knew he was aware. The air had changed. The town felt like a held breath. Blackwood's men were no longer trying to be subtle. They stood on street corners, their presence an open threat. They were watching the smithy. They were waiting. Alara didn't hesitate. She went straight to Jedediah, the ledger page in her hand. She told him everything, the truth about her father, about Blackwood, about the targeted destruction of her family. The old blacksmith listened in silence, his face growing harder and more grim with every word. When she was finished, he placed his large, calloused hand over hers. "This isn't your fight alone, child," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's ours." But Blackwood was a step ahead. He knew the ledger page was a death sentence if it ever reached a federal marshal. He knew Alara was the living proof of his greatest crime. He couldn't afford to let her live, but a direct attack was too messy, too public. He needed to silence her, and he needed the ledger. The next morning, Jedediah was gone. There was no sign of a struggle in the smithy. His bed was neatly made. A half-eaten breakfast sat on the small table in the back. But on the anvil, the symbolic heart of the forge, rested a single polished black stone Blackwood's calling card. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Alara. She ran outside, her eyes scanning the street. One of Blackwood's thugs, the one with the flattened nose, was leaning against a post across the way. He saw her and smiled a sickening, triumphant leer. He pushed himself off the post and walked to the center of the street, dropping a folded piece of paper into the dust before walking away. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The handwriting was elegant, precise, a chilling contrast to the brutal message it contained. "The old man is my guest at the mission of San Coronado. He is quite safe for now. His continued health depends on your cooperation. Bring me the deed to your family's land and the page from my ledger. Come alone, at sundown tomorrow. If you are not there, I will send him back to you, piece by piece." The mission of San Coronado. A crumbling Spanish ruin in the heart of the Badlands, a place avoided by locals said to be haunted by the ghosts of a forgotten war. It was the perfect place for an execution. This was the trap. Blackwood had taken the last piece of her new life and was using it as bait to destroy the last piece of her old one. He had forced her into a corner, isolating her from the law, from the town, from any hope of help. He wanted her alone, broken and desperate. Before leaving town, she went to Deputy Miller's office. She didn't tell him her plan. She simply handed him a hand-drawn map. "The depot in the Box Canyon is here," she said. "Tanner is hiding here. He'll talk. He's afraid, but he'll talk." She then drew a third X on the map. "And this is the old mission. If you and a posse don't hear from me by morning, you'll find Blackwood there." Miller looked at the map and then at her, his young face pale with the weight of the responsibility she had just given him. "Alara, don't do this. It's a suicide run. He has Jedediah," she replied, her voice leaving no room for argument. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Be the lawman this town needs, Miller, not the one it has." She rode out under the afternoon sun, a lone figure heading east toward the jagged peaks of the Badlands. She was not just a girl seeking to save her friend. She was the sum of her father's legacy and her mother's love, carrying the weight of a justice that had been denied for 5 long years. She was riding into the heart of the storm. The mission of San Coronado rose from the desert like a broken bone. Its adobe walls were crumbling, and the bell tower listed to one side, a silent sentinel over a domain of dust and decay. A violent sandstorm born in the blistering heat of the afternoon was raging across the Badlands. The wind shrieked, peeling sand from the dunes and hurling it against the ancient walls. It was a world of roiling brown chaos, a fitting backdrop for the night's work. Alara left her horse in a sheltered arroyo and approached the mission on foot, and the wind tearing at her, her face covered by a bandana. The storm was a gift. It provided cover, its roar masking the sound of her approach. Blackwood would have lookouts, but in this maelstrom, eyes were useless. She slipped through a collapsed section of the outer wall, moving like a shadow through the ruined courtyard. The main chapel was ahead, a few flickering lanterns casting a sickly yellow light through its arched, paneless windows. That was where he would be. Inside, the scene was exactly as she had pictured it. Silas Blackwood stood before the crumbling altar, looking as calm and immaculate as he had in the forge. The storm outside seemed not to touch him. Jedediah was tied to a heavy wooden chair to the side, his face bruised, but his eyes defiant. 2 of Blackwood's men, including the brute with the flattened nose, stood guard near the entrance. "You came," Blackwood said, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "I confess I wasn't certain you had it in you." Punctual, too. Alara walked slowly into the center of the chapel, the ledger page, and a folded deed in her hand. The wind swirled dust through the gaping holes in the roof, making the lantern light dance and cast long, monstrous shadows. "Let him go," she said, her voice low and steady. "You have what you want." Almost Blackwood corrected a thin smile on his lips. He gestured to the papers. Place them on the altar. Then we can conclude our business." As she moved forward, he continued his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "It's a shame, really. I do admire your tenacity. You have your father's iron will. A pity he lacked the foresight to match it." He stepped away from the altar, circling her like a wolf. "Did Tanner tell you the whole story, or just the parts that painted your sainted father as a martyr?" Elara didn't answer. She placed the papers on the stone slab. "I imagine he left out the most interesting detail," Blackwood mused. He reached into his coat and produced a folded, yellowed letter. He tossed it onto the altar beside the other documents. "Your sainted father wasn't a hero, girl. He used a forged testimony to send my brother to the gallows." Elara's eyes darted to the letter. She could see the faded ink, the official seal. "Oh, it's quite real," Blackwood assured her. "A letter from the witness, confessing everything written years later out of guilt. He admitted your father paid him handsomely for his lies. My brother was an obstacle, you see. His claim on a piece of land stood in the way of your father's political ambitions. So he had him removed. Legally. An act of perfect, unimpeachable injustice." The words hit Elara with the force of a physical blow. She stared at the letter, her mind reeling. Could it be true? Her father, the man she remembered as the pillar of justice and integrity, a man who would suborn perjury for political gain? It didn't excuse Blackwood's monstrous revenge, but it stained her father's memory, twisting her righteous quest for vengeance into something murky and complicated. Her black and white world shattered into 1,000 shades of gray. "He took my brother's future," Blackwood hissed, his composure finally cracking, his voice thick with a 5-year-old grief. "So I took his. An eye for an eye. A legacy for a legacy. It is the purest form of justice there is." He nodded to his men. "Kill her." The brute raised his pistol, the smile returning to his face. But Elara was already moving. In that moment of revelation, of confusion and shattered certainty, one thing had become clear: she would not be defined by the sins of either man. With a swift, practiced motion, she swept her arm across the altar, grabbing not a weapon, but the heavy iron candlesticks. She hurled one at the lantern nearest the door, plunging that side of the chapel into darkness. The second she threw at the other lantern, and the room was swallowed by a near-total blackness, the only light the occasional flash of lightning from the storm outside. A pistol shot roared, the muzzle flash, a brief blinding flower in the dark. The bullet splintered a wooden pew where she had been standing. "Find her," Blackwood roared, but Elara was no longer there. She was using the storm and the darkness, the chaos. She had spent years learning to be invisible. The howling wind covered the sound of her movements as she slipped between the pews. The intermittent flashes of lightning were her map, allowing her to see the positions of the men in stark, frozen tableaus. The brute was stumbling blindly toward the altar. Elara circled behind him. In a flash of lightning, she saw his silhouette. She lunged not with a knife, but with the length of chain she had taken from the smithy wrapped around her fist. She brought it down hard on the back of his neck. He crumpled without a sound. The second man was panicking, firing wildly into the darkness. Elara dropped to the floor, crawling beneath the pews. She came up behind him, her hunting knife in her hand. She didn't kill him. She sliced the gun belt from his waist. He spun around empty-handed and terrified as she melted back into the shadows. Now it was just Blackwood. "You can't hide forever, girl," he shouted, his voice strained. A flash of lightning illuminated the chapel. Elara was standing right in front of him, her face a mask of cold fury. He raised his own pistol, but she was too close, too fast. She slammed the heel of her boot onto his instep, and as he gasped in pain, she brought her fists, still wrapped in the iron chain, up under his jaw. His head snapped back and the pistol clattered to the stone floor. She kicked the gun away. He was disarmed, helpless. Her knife was in her hand. Her heart pounded with a furious, vengeful rhythm. Here he was, the author of her pain. The man who had murdered her parents, destroyed her life, and haunted her dreams. All it would take was a single final motion, an act of justice, an act of revenge. She looked at his face, contorted with hatred and fear, and then she looked over at Jedediah, tied to the chair, watching her. She thought of her father, a man now revealed to be flawed, a man whose own injustice had started this entire cycle of violence. To kill Blackwood now would be to become him. It would be to continue the cycle of blood for blood. With a shuddering breath, she stepped back. She would not be his monster. No, she said, her voice clear and strong above the storm. You're going to face the law, the real law. You're going to stand in a courtroom and answer for what you did to my family. You're going to lose everything just like you made me do. But you're going to do it while you're alive to see it. At that moment, the great wooden doors of the chapel burst open. A figure stood silhouetted against the raging storm, a rifle held at the ready. It was Maka. He had followed her. He always did. He took in the scene, the two downed men, the disarmed Blackwood Alara standing victorious, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He was there to ensure none of Blackwood's other men could interfere. She had not been alone after all. Her fight was her own, but her back was guarded. The storm broke with the dawn. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the clouds, casting a clean, washed light over the desert, Deputy Miller and a posse of 10 armed townsmen rode up to the mission. They found Blackwood and his 2 thugs bound securely with rope from the church bell tower. Alara was sitting on the steps, tending to Jedediah's wounds, while Maka watched impassively from the shadows of the doorway. Miller dismounted, his face a mixture of awe and relief. Alara, we got your message. We found Tanner. He's talking. He's telling us everything. Blackwood glared at Alara as the deputy hauled him to his feet. This isn't over, he spat. Yes, it is, Alara said quietly, not looking at him. She was looking at Jedediah, whose weary face was filled with a fierce fatherly pride. The ride back to redemption was a strange procession. The captured villains, the triumphant posse, and the quiet girl who had faced down the monster that had terrorized them all. When they reached Main Street, the townspeople emerged from their homes and businesses. They saw Blackwood defeated and in chains, and a slow rising cheer went up. They looked at Alara, no longer the blacksmith's silent, haunted apprentice, but their protector. They rallied around the smithy, their pledges to help Jedediah rebuild and stand strong, echoing in the clear morning air. With Blackwood in a federal cell and the evidence from the ledger and Tanner's confession, his empire crumbled like the mission's adobe walls. The corruption he had spread through the territory was rooted out. The law, slow but inexorable, was finally working. Months later, a semblance of peace had settled over the valley. The seasons had turned. The land, freed from the grip of Blackwood's ambition, began to heal. Alara stood on a high bluff, overlooking a wide, fertile stretch of land, her family's land. The deed, now legally hers, was not a tool for rebuilding her old life. The girl who had lived in that house was gone forever. Instead, working with Jedediah and the town council, she had used the land to establish a trust, a sanctuary for the families Blackwood had displaced, giving them a place to start anew. The wind, cool and clean, whipped strands of her dark hair across her face. From a worn leather pouch at her belt, she withdrew a heavy, rust-pitted piece of iron, the collar. She had kept it all these years, a dark relic, a constant physical reminder of her pain. She had thought it was a way to never forget what was taken from her. But now she understood it was an anchor chaining her to a past that no longer had power over her. Her fingers traced the rough metal one last time. She remembered the cold weight of it, the way it chafed her skin, the finality of the lock clicking shut. She remembered the girl who had worn it, a girl defined by fear and loss. She was not that girl anymore. She was a blacksmith who shaped steel. She was a friend who protected her family. She was a woman who had faced the architect of her own hell and chosen not vengeance, but justice. With a cry that was torn from the very depths of her soul, a sound of grief, of release, of triumph, she drew her arm back and hurled the iron collar into the vast, empty space of the canyon below. It spun through the air, a dark speck against the brilliant blue sky, before disappearing into the shadows, gone forever. A quiet footstep sounded behind her. Maka stood there, his weathered face calm. He looked from her to the canyon, then back again. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply stood beside her, a fellow survivor, an equal. Together, they looked out toward the horizon, a future unwritten. Alara was no longer a victim defined by her trauma, nor a daughter defined by her father's complicated legacy. She was simply Alara, a woman forged in fire, finally free.